Did you know that? Before 1940, over 75% of black Americans lived in the South, mostly in rural poverty, and that by 1970, that number had dropped to just over 50%, with most living in cities across the country. This massive shift in American life didn't just happen. It was powered by a global conflict. A war that promised to make the world safe for democracy also unintentionally lit a fire under a struggle for democracy right here at home. We often think of the civil rights movement as a story of the 1950s and 1960s. We picture Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. We see grainy images of sit-ins and marches. But what if the seeds of that movement were planted a generation earlier? What if the fight against fascism abroad created a generation of black Americans who were unwilling to accept oppression at home? How could fighting for freedom thousands of miles away change the definition of freedom in your own backyard? The story isn't as simple as we think. It's a story of paradoxes, a story of fighting for a country that didn't always fight for you. It's about how a world war became a catalyst for a revolution at home in ways both big and small, planned and accidental. Number 18, how do you put a lid back on a pot that has boiled over? Before the war, the system of segregation, particularly in the South, relied on a certain psychological control. It was about instilling a sense of place, a sense of limits. Generations had been born into a world where certain doors were closed, certain fountains were off limits, and certain ambitions were considered dangerous. And this wasn't just enforced by laws, but by, a powerful, pervasive culture of deference and fear. It was a psychological cage as much as a physical one. The war took a sledgehammer to that cage. It fundamentally altered the self-perception of millions of black Americans. This wasn't a policy change or a new law, it was a change in the mind. And that may have been the most revolutionary change of all. Imagine being a young black man from rural Mississippi. Your world has been small, defined by the farm, the church, and the rigid rules of Jim Crow. Suddenly, you are in the army, you are sent to France or Britain or the Philippines. For the first time in your life, you interact with white people who do not treat you as an inferior. A French family might invite you into their home for dinner, treating you not as a black soldier, but as an American liberator. In a pub in England, you could drink a beer alongside white soldiers without a second thought. You were part of a massive, world-changing effort. You were given a rifle, a uniform, and a mission that the President of the United States said was to save democracy. You were told you were fighting against a hateful ideology of racial supremacy. Then you come home, you get off the train in Mississippi still wearing that uniform, and you're told you can't use the main waiting room. You have to go around to the back. You're told to step off the sidewalk when a white person approaches. The very things you were fighting against abroad were waiting for you at home. The contrast was jarring. It was insulting. It was infuriating. This experience was repeated for over 1 million black men and women who served. They had seen a different world, and they had seen themselves in a different light. The old psychological limits seemed absurd. The historian John Hope Franklin noted that returning black veterans were determined to have democracy at home. They had earned it. The uniform, which was supposed to be a symbol of national unity, became a symbol of this deep hypocrisy. This psychological shift wasn't limited to soldiers. On the home front, a black woman who had only ever worked as a domestic servant might get a job in a factory building airplanes. She earned her own money, good money, for the first time. She joined a union, she lived in a new city, away from the direct personal oppression of her old life. She was a vital part of the war effort. Posters and newsreels told her she was. This new economic independence and sense of purpose changed her expectations. Why should she go back to making a few dollars a week cleaning someone else's house? Why should her children be denied the opportunities that her labor was helping to secure? The black press, which exploded in circulation during the war, fed this new consciousness. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender framed the war as a two-front battle. They relentlessly pointed out the contradictions. Their reporting gave a national voice to the feelings of millions, letting a factory worker in Detroit know that a soldier in the Pacific and a farmer in Alabama felt the same way. This created a shared sense of identity and grievance that was more powerful than ever before. It wasn't just a collection of individual frustrations anymore. It was a national mood, a collective impatience. The old justifications for segregation sounded hollow. The old ways of life were no longer acceptable. The war had boiled the pot, and the lid was never going to fit back on. This new mindset, this refusal to accept the status quo, was the essential human fuel for the civil rights movement. What percentage of black veterans suffered from undiagnosed psychological trauma, not from combat, but from the whiplash of being treated as heroes abroad and second-class citizens at home? How many unrecorded conversations between returning soldiers and their families were the true birthplaces of local civil rights activism? Were there government programs now lost to history that specifically aimed to reacclimate black soldiers to Jim Crow life upon their return? Number 17, what happens when you give a man a gun and then tell him he's not a man? The experience of black soldiers during World War II was a study in contradictions. On one hand, the military offered opportunities for training, travel, and responsibility that were unthinkable in civilian life. On the other, it was a rigidly segregated institution that often relegated black soldiers to labor battalions and service roles, questioning their courage and capability at every turn. Yet, in the crucible of combat, something powerful was forged. Black soldiers proved their mettle, created their own legends, and returned home with a set of skills and a level of confidence that the architects of segregation never anticipated. The veteran became a new kind of leader in the black community. Take the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers. They were one of the first black armored units to see combat. They fought for 183 straight days, from France across to Germany and Austria. They were instrumental in key battles. The men of the 761st were not just soldiers, they were highly trained technicians, mechanics, and warriors operating complex machinery under the most intense pressure imaginable. They were commanded to be better, faster, and more disciplined than their white counterparts because they were under constant scrutiny. They came home not just as men who had seen war, but as men who had mastered its tools and tactics. One member of the 761st was a young second lieutenant named Jackie Robinson. His experiences with racism in the military, including a court-martial for refusing to move to the back of a segregated military bus, hardened his resolve. The discipline and courage he learned in the Army undoubtedly prepared him for the immense pressure of breaking baseball's color barrier in 1947. Then there were the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group. They were the subjects of an experiment to see if black men had the intelligence and coordination to fly sophisticated combat aircraft. They didn't just succeed, they excelled. They became one of the most respected escort units in the Army Air Forces, famous for protecting bombers. Their record was extraordinary. These men were not just pilots, they were navigators, bombardiers, and mechanics. They were an elite, highly educated group who had mastered the most advanced technology of the day. When they returned, they were not inclined to accept menial jobs or social inferiority. Men like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., their commander, went on to become the first black general in the U.S. Air Force, paving the way for others. Many others became doctors, lawyers, and politicians, using their prestige and skills to lead civil rights efforts. The experience of combat itself created a bond and a new sense of empowerment. When you have faced death alongside other men, when you have fought and bled for your country, it becomes impossible to believe you are somehow less of a citizen than someone who has not. The very act of being a soldier, of being entrusted with a weapon, and the defense of the nation is a powerful statement of citizenship. The government itself had certified these men as capable and worthy of the ultimate responsibility. When they returned, they were organized, disciplined, and unafraid. They knew how to follow orders, but they also knew how to give them. They knew how to organize a platoon. They could certainly organize a voter registration drive. They had faced a foreign enemy. They were not easily intimidated by a local sheriff. Medgar Evers, who would become a pivotal civil rights leader in Mississippi, was a veteran of the Normandy invasion. He said his time in the Army taught him that it was time to fight for his rights at home. Charles Evers, his brother, said, "The Army changed our whole lives. We went in boys and came out men." This transformation happened in hundreds of thousands of men. They formed the backbone of the early civil rights movement. They were the ones who founded new NAACP chapters, who led voter registration drives in the most dangerous parts of the South, who provided security for activists, and who became the first to challenge segregation in courts and in the streets. And they had been trained by the U.S. government to be fighters, and when they came home, they found a new war waiting for them. How many undocumented acts of resistance by black soldiers against segregation within the military have been deliberately erased from official records? What was the true number of black officers who were pushed out of the service after the war to prevent them from becoming influential leaders? Did the skills black soldiers learned in specialized intelligence and communications units get repurposed to build sophisticated activist networks back home? Number 16, can you demand freedom for the world if you deny it at home? The war was, above all, a battle of ideas. The United States and its allies framed the conflict as a struggle for democracy against tyranny, for freedom against oppression, for equality against the doctrine of racial supremacy. This was the message broadcast around the world. It was printed on posters, declared in presidential speeches, and taught to every soldier. This powerful, pervasive propaganda created a glaring, undeniable hypocrisy that black Americans and their allies seized upon. How could America be a beacon of freedom for the world when it practiced segregation and discrimination against millions of its own citizens? This question became a powerful weapon. The Double V campaign was the perfect expression of this idea. The slogan, first proposed in a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier in January 1942, stood for two victories: victory over the Axis powers abroad and victory over racism at home. The idea was electric. It spread like wildfire through black communities. The double five became a symbol you would see on pins, on posters, in church bulletins. It was a simple, powerful way to articulate the dual struggle. It allowed black Americans to be patriotic, to support the war effort, while simultaneously demanding that the country live up to its own ideals. It was a way of saying, we are fighting for the same democracy you are, and we demand our share of it. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a framework for action. It motivated black workers to be productive in defense industries, soldiers to fight bravely, and activists to push harder. Every time President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech about the four freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, civil rights leaders would ask why these freedoms didn't apply to black people in Georgia or Alabama. When America condemned the enemy's racial theories, the NAACP would publish a report on lynching in the South. The contrast was stark and embarrassing on the world stage. The war also brought international attention to America's race problem. As the United States positioned itself as the leader of the free world, its allies and enemies alike pointed to segregation as a deep flaw. The German regime's propaganda machine, for instance, often used stories and pictures of racial violence in the U.S. to undermine the American message and to try to appeal to non-white populations around the globe. This international scrutiny put pressure on the federal government. American diplomats found it difficult to promote democracy in other countries when they were asked to explain lynchings or poll taxes. This was a new kind of pressure. For the first time, American racism was not just a domestic issue, it was a foreign policy liability. This ideological battle armed a generation of activists with a powerful moral argument. It was an argument that was hard to refute because it used America's own words against itself. When veterans returned and demanded the right to vote, they weren't just asking for a personal privilege. They were asking for the very democracy they had fought to defend. When parents sued to desegregate schools, they were arguing for the equality that the nation claimed to champion. The war provided the ultimate, unassailable moral high ground. The language of the war freedom, democracy, anti-racism became the language of the civil rights movement. The fight against fascism abroad had made the fight against racism at home a moral and political necessity. The country could no longer hide from its own contradictions. How many foreign diplomats privately filed reports back to their home countries detailing the hypocrisy of American democracy, and what impact did these reports have on Cold War alliances? Were there secret directives within the U.S. government to suppress news of racial incidents to avoid international embarrassment during the war? To what extent did the Double V campaign inspire anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia, who saw a parallel in the struggle? Or number 15, could a train ticket be more powerful than a protest sign? The story of the civil rights movement is often told in courtrooms and at marches, but one of its most important catalysts was much quieter: the sound of a train pulling out of a southern station heading north or west. The war triggered the Second Great Migration, a movement of people that was larger and faster than the first one that had followed World War I. Between 1940 and 1960, more than 5 million black Americans left the rural South. They were pulled by the promise of jobs in the booming defense industries and pushed by the continuing oppression and economic stagnation of the Jim Crow system. This migration didn't just change the map of Black America, it rewired its political and social power. Before the war, the vast majority of Black Americans lived in places where they were systematically disenfranchised. They were denied the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. They had little to no political power. They were largely rural, isolated, and economically dependent on the white landowning class. Moving to a city like Detroit, Chicago, Oakland, or Los Angeles was a radical act. It was a move from a place of near total powerlessness to a place of potential power. In the industrial centers of the North and West, Black migrants could do something they could not do in the South vote. As their numbers grew in these cities, they became a significant political bloc. Politicians, for the first time, had to court the Black vote. Black communities could elect their own representatives to city councils and state legislatures. By 1944, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was elected to Congress from Harlem, a direct result of this growing urban political power. This gave Black Americans a voice in the halls of power, a voice that could advocate for federal action against the very injustices they had fled. The issues of the South were no longer just regional problems, they were national issues being debated on the floor of Congress. Furthermore, urbanization changed the nature of community and organizing. In the rural South, organizing was difficult and dangerous. In the cities, people were concentrated, churches, social clubs, and union halls became centers of political activity. Organizations like the NAACP saw their membership skyrocket in these new urban communities. New, more confrontational organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality Corps were born in these cities. There was a new sense of safety in numbers. A protest that would be unthinkable in a small Mississippi town was possible on the streets of Chicago. The city became an incubator for the tactics and strategies of the future civil rights movement. The economic impact was also profound. A man who earned pennies a day as a sharecropper could suddenly earn a steady, decent wage in a shipyard or a steel mill. This economic independence was a form of liberation. It meant not being dependent on the whim of a white boss or landlord. It allowed families to save money, buy homes, and send their children to better schools. It created a new Black middle class with the resources and the confidence to fund and lead the fight for civil rights. The money that flowed from these northern jobs back to families still in the South also helped sustain the struggle there. A train ticket didn't just move a person. It moved political power, economic resources, and a spirit of possibility across the country. This demographic revolution laid the essential groundwork for a national movement. What was the true economic value in today's dollars that was transferred from the southern agricultural economy to northern industrial centers through Black migration during the war? How many clandestine networks, like an underground railroad of information, existed to help people plan their moves and find jobs and housing in the North? Did Southern states engage in any secret, illegal efforts to prevent Black workers from leaving, knowing it would cripple their labor supply? Number 14, what does a paycheck have to do with freedom? For millions of Black Americans, the war offered something that had been systematically denied to them for generations: a good, steady job. The demand for labor in defense industries was insatiable. With 16 million Americans, mostly white men, in the military, factories were desperate for workers. This desperation cracked open doors that had been firmly shut. The economic empowerment that resulted was not just about money. It was about dignity, independence, and the creation of a stable foundation from which to fight for broader civil rights. Before the war, Black workers were largely confined to the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. They were sharecroppers, domestic servants, or unskilled laborers, often trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency. The wages were abysmal, the work was insecure, and the opportunities for advancement were non-existent. The war changed this equation. A Black man could leave a farm in Alabama, where he made less than $300 a year, and get a job in a Detroit auto factory, converted for war production, making over $2,000 a year. This was a life-altering transformation. This economic shift was not given freely. In the early stages of the war boom, most defense contractors still refused to hire Black workers for skilled positions or at all. This is where activism played a crucial role. Philip Randolph's threatened March on Washington in 1941, which we will discuss more, forced President Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in the defense industry and creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee FEP. The FEPEC was underfunded and lacked strong enforcement powers, but it was a start. It established the principle that the federal government had a role in ensuring fair employment. For the first time, black workers had a federal agency, however flawed, to which they could appeal. Thousands of complaints were filed, and the FEP's investigations and hearings put a spotlight on discriminatory practices. The result was a dramatic increase in black industrial employment. In 1942, black workers held only 3% of defense jobs. By 1945, that figure had climbed to over 8%. This meant more than 1 million black men and women entered the industrial workforce. For many, this was their first encounter with unionized labor. While many unions were themselves discriminatory, others, like the United Auto Workers UAW and the United Steelworkers USW, began to see the importance of interracial solidarity. Black workers became active union members, learning valuable skills in organizing, collective bargaining, and leadership. These skills would be directly transferable to the civil rights movement. This newfound economic stability had a ripple effect. A family with a steady income could afford better housing and nutrition. They could keep their children in school longer. They could donate money to the NAACP or their local church's activist committee. They could participate in boycotts without the fear of immediate starvation. The economic power translated into social and political power. It created a generation of black Americans who were not just demanding rights in the abstract, but who had the economic security to stand up and fight for them. The link between economic justice and civil rights became crystal clear. The fight for a fair wage was inseparable from the fight for a fair society. The war, by cracking open the door to economic opportunity, gave the movement the material resources it needed to grow. How many black families were lifted out of poverty by war-related employment, and how does that number compare to the New Deal programs that preceded it? What percentage of the NIACP's budget in the late 1940s came from small donations from these newly employed industrial workers? Are there sealed corporate archives from defense contractors that detail their internal debates about complying with Executive Order 8802? Number 13, could one man's threat change a president's mind? Sometimes the threat of action is as powerful as the action itself. In 1941, as the United States was becoming the arsenal of democracy, that arsenal was being built almost exclusively by white hands. Defense industries, flush with government contracts, openly refused to hire black workers. The irony was bitter. E.A. Philip Randolph, the charismatic and respected leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, decided to force the issue. His strategy would provide a blueprint for the future of civil rights protest and demonstrate that organized, non-violent mass pressure could bend the will of the federal government. Randolph was not a newcomer to organizing. His union was one of the most powerful black-led organizations in the country. He saw the war boom as a moment of maximum leverage. He declared that if the government would not end discrimination in the defense industries and the military, he would lead 100,000 black Americans in a massive march on Washington, D.C. The date was set for July 1st, 1941. This was a radical idea. A mass march on the Capitol of this scale had never been attempted by a black-led movement. It was a direct challenge to President Roosevelt's administration, which was desperate to maintain national unity as the prospect of war loomed. The Roosevelt administration was terrified of the prospect. The image of 100,000 black protesters flooding the Capitol would be a massive propaganda victory for America's enemies. It would shatter the illusion of a unified nation preparing for war. Roosevelt sent his wife, Eleanor, and other liaisons to try to talk Randolph down. They pleaded with him, warning that the march could lead to violence and set back the cause of racial equality. Randolph refused to budge. His demand was simple: a presidential order banning discrimination. No order, no deal. He understood his power at that moment. The pressure was immense. Just 1 week before the march was scheduled to take place, Roosevelt yielded. On June 25th, 1941, he issued Executive Order 8802. It declared that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. To investigate complaints, it established the Fair Employment Practices Committee FEP. While the order did not address segregation in the armed forces, it was a monumental victory. It was the most significant federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. The success of the March on Washington movement, which existed without ever actually marching, was a watershed moment. It taught several crucial lessons that would be absorbed by the next generation of activists. First, it showed that direct nonviolent mass action could be a powerful tool. The threat was enough to force a concession from the highest office in the land. Second, it demonstrated the power of an all-black-led movement. Randolph had insisted that the movement be organized and run by black people, believing it was essential for building self-reliance and political power. Third, it linked economic opportunity directly to the fight for civil rights. This event was a direct precursor to the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. would give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Well, Philip Randolph was there, an elder statesman of the movement he had helped to create. Bayard Rustin, a key organizer of the 1963 March, was a young activist who had worked with Randolph in the 1940s. The strategies and the very idea of a mass march on the Capitol as a tool for change were born out of this wartime confrontation. It was a pivotal moment when the potential of organized, collective black power was demonstrated to the nation and the world. What did President Roosevelt's private logs or letters reveal about his true feelings toward Randolph's ultimatum? How close did the March on Washington movement actually come to its goal of 100,000 participants based on regional organizing records that may still exist? Were there counterintelligence plans by federal agencies to disrupt or infiltrate the movement? Had the march gone forward? Number 12, who was Rosie the Riveter's forgotten sister? The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter is a white woman with a determined look, flexing her bicep, a symbol of the millions of women who entered the workforce to support the war effort. But this image tells only part of the story. For every white Rosie, there was a black Rosie, whose journey to the factory floor was often longer and more difficult, and whose contribution was just as vital. The war provided an unprecedented, if complicated, opportunity for black women to break out of the narrow economic roles prescribed for them. Before the war, over 70% of employed black women worked in two occupations, domestic service or agriculture. The pay was low, the hours were long, and the work was often demeaning and insecure. The war's labor shortage changed that. While they faced a double discrimination, both as women and as black people, they fought for and won entry into industries previously closed to them. They built ships in Mobile, packed ammunition in St. Louis, and riveted airplane wings in Los Angeles. The numbers tell the story. The number of black women working as domestic servants fell by 15% during the war. At the same time, the number of black women employed in factories and other industrial jobs grew from around 7% to nearly 19%. This was a seismic shift. Like their male counterparts, these women experienced a dramatic increase in wages and a newfound sense of economic independence. A woman named Ruth Wilson, in a later interview, recalled leaving a domestic job that paid $7 a week to work in the Philadelphia Navy Yard for $36 a week. This money allowed her to better provide for her family and to see a future beyond mere survival. This work was not just about a paycheck. It was about acquiring new skills and a new sense of self-worth. It challenged traditional notions of what was considered women's work. Many of these women became union members, and within the unions, they fought not just for better pay, but also for equality. They challenged discriminatory practices by both employers and their white union colleagues. Women like the union organizer Miranda Smith in North Carolina became powerful voices for both workers' rights and civil rights. This experience empowered a generation of women who would become the ground soldiers and local leaders of the civil rights movement. The organizing skills, the economic independence, and the sheer confidence gained in the war years were invaluable. These were the women who would later organize carpools during the Montgomery bus boycott, who would house and feed student activists during Freedom Summer, and who would lead local NAACP chapters. The historian Darlene Clark Hine has written extensively on how these wartime experiences prepared black women for post-war activism. They had proven to themselves and the world that they could do the men's work of building a nation at war. They were more than ready to do the work of building a more just nation in peace. The forgotten Black Rosies were not just supporting the war, they were forging a new identity and a new role in the fight for freedom. How many workplace discrimination complaints were filed with the VPC by Black women? And what was their success rate compared to those filed by Black men? So what happened to the specialized skills many Black women learned when they were pushed out of industrial jobs after the war to make way for returning white male veterans? Are there oral histories from Black Rosie the Riveters that remain uncollected and stored in family attics, telling a different story of the home front? Number 11. Could a law meant for everyone end up dividing everyone? The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill, is often hailed as one of the most transformative pieces of social legislation in American history. It was designed to help returning veterans transition back to civilian life by providing them with benefits like low-cost mortgages, low-interest business loans, and tuition assistance for college. It is credited with creating the modern American middle class, but the story of the GI Bill is also a story of deep and lasting inequality. While the law itself was federally written to be race neutral, it was administered at the local level, where the prejudices of the Jim Crow era ensured that its benefits flowed overwhelmingly to white veterans, while Black veterans were often shut out. In theory, the GI Bill was a promise of upward mobility for all who served. For many Black veterans, it was a promise broken. Take the housing provisions. The bill guaranteed low interest, zero down payment, home loans. This fueled the massive suburban boom of the late 1940s and 1950s. However, the Federal Housing Administration, which underwrote these loans, openly practiced a policy known as redlining, which designated Black neighborhoods as financial risks and discouraged lending in those areas. Banks would simply refuse to lend to Black veterans trying to buy homes in white neighborhoods. As a result, white veterans were able to build wealth through homeownership, the primary engine of intergenerational wealth in America. Here, Black veterans were largely excluded, deepening the racial wealth gap that persists to this day. The historian Ira Katznelson, in his book When Affirmative Action Was White, meticulously documents how these discriminatory practices turned a program meant for all into a massive affirmative action program for white Americans. The educational benefits were also unevenly distributed. While thousands of Black veterans did use the GI Bill to attend college, their choices were limited. They were often denied admission to white universities, especially in the South. They were forced to apply to the historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, which were underfunded and overwhelmed by the sudden influx of students. While the GI Bill led to a dramatic increase in the number of Black college graduates, creating a new generation of educated leaders, lawyers, and doctors who would be crucial to the civil rights movement, the opportunity was not equal. A Black veteran in Mississippi had far fewer options than a white veteran in New York. The story wasn't all negative. The very existence of the GI Bill's promises created a new set of expectations. When those promises were denied, it fueled a sense of righteous anger and a determination to fight for what was rightfully theirs. The lawyers who would eventually argue Brown v. Board of Education, like Thurgood Marshall, were part of this educated class that the GI Bill, even in its flawed application, helped to expand. The veterans who were denied housing loans became the plaintiffs in lawsuits challenging restrictive covenants. The frustration and betrayal felt by so many Black veterans who had served their country only to be denied its rewards added a powerful new energy to the burgeoning civil rights movement. The GI Bill, in both its successes and its failures, became a central battlefield in the fight for equality. What is the exact dollar amount of wealth that was generated for white families through GI Bill home loans compared to Black families from 1945 to 1960? How many qualified Black veterans were denied college admission by state universities that were receiving federal funds, a clear violation of any non-discriminatory principle? Did any officials at the federal level know that local administration of the GI Bill was systematically discriminatory and choose to do nothing about it? Number 10, can a riot be a form of progress? On a hot summer day in June 1943, the city of Detroit exploded. A fist fight between a white man and a Black man on a bridge spiraled into 3 days of racial violence. By the time federal troops restored order, 34 people were dead, Hundreds were injured, and millions of dollars of property had been destroyed. The Detroit Race Riot of 1943 was one of the most violent episodes of civil unrest in 20th century America. It was a brutal, tragic event. Yet, in a painful and paradoxical way, the very social tensions that led to the riot were a sign of the changes that were fueling the push for civil rights. The riot was a symptom of a system under strain, of old hierarchies being challenged. Detroit was a microcosm of the dramatic social changes happening across the country. The city was a major hub of the defense industry, the arsenal democracy. Its population had swelled with migrants seeking work. Hundreds of thousands of white Southerners and black Southerners had poured into the city, bringing their hopes, their labor, and their prejudices with them. They were crowded into inadequate housing, competing for jobs, and using the same strained public services. The city was a pressure cooker. The competition was fierce. Black workers newly hired in auto plants under the pressure of the FEPs were often met with hostility from white workers. And white workers would stage hate strikes to protest the promotion of black employees to more skilled positions or their integration into previously all-white departments. The friction was constant. Black families trying to move into better housing in traditionally white neighborhoods were met with violence. The riot was not a sudden, spontaneous event. It was the culmination of thousands of smaller conflicts over jobs, housing, and public space. While horrific, the riot made it impossible for the nation to ignore the racial tensions simmering beneath the surface of the war effort. It was a stark reminder that the fight for democracy was not just happening overseas. The riot was headline news across the country and around the world. It forced civic leaders, politicians, and industrial managers in Detroit and other cities to confront the issue of race relations in a way they never had before. And in the aftermath, Detroit's mayor established the first interracial committee in the city's history to address the root causes of the conflict. And labor unions like the UAW, which had members on both sides of the fighting, were forced to take a stronger, more public stance against racism within their ranks, knowing that such divisions could destroy their organization. For Black Americans, the riot was a traumatic event, but it also marked a shift. As historian Thomas J. Sugrue points out, unlike earlier racial conflicts where Black people were primarily victims in Detroit, there was a new level of organized self-defense and resistance. It was a sign of the growing refusal to be passive in the face of white mob violence. The riot, and others like it that occurred in cities like Harlem during the war, laid bare the raw, unresolved racial conflicts in American life. They were a violent expression of the social upheaval caused by the war, an upheaval that was breaking down old patterns of life and in the process creating the conditions for a new fight for civil rights. Were there organized groups outside of law enforcement that systematically instigated violence during the Detroit riot to advance a specific political agenda? How did the Black press in other cities report on the events in Detroit, and did it lead to the formation of self-defense groups elsewhere? What long-term psychological impact did witnessing the riot have on the children who grew up to be the activists of the 1960s? Number 9, how do you fight a war when you're fighting each other? The war forced the American military to confront a fundamental contradiction. How can you build the most efficient and powerful fighting force in the world while maintaining a system of rigid racial segregation? The system was not only morally wrong, it was incredibly inefficient. The experience of the war, with its constant demand for manpower and its logistical challenges, exposed the practical absurdity of segregation and laid the groundwork for its eventual abolition in the armed forces. In the early years of the war, the military was a mirror of society. Black soldiers were separated from white soldiers in everything from barracks and mess halls to blood banks. The Navy relegated most black sailors to roles as stewards and messmen. The Army created entire separate divisions and regiments, most of which were used for manual labor, building roads and unloading supplies rather than combat. This created a massive wasteful duplication of resources. You needed 2 sets of training facilities, 2 sets of barracks, 2 sets of everything. More importantly, it was a colossal waste of human talent. A black man who might have been a brilliant mechanic or a natural leader was instead assigned to dig ditches simply because of the color of his skin. The Army's own studies, like the 1925 report, The Use of Negro Manpower in War, were filled with racist assumptions that black soldiers were intellectually inferior and lacked courage, justifying their use in non-combat roles. The performance of units like the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion directly challenged and refuted these stereotypes, but the prejudice was deeply ingrained. As the war dragged on, however, the realities of combat began to chip away at the system. In the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, U.S. forces faced a severe shortage of combat infantrymen. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a pragmatic, not a moral, decision. He called for black soldiers from service units to volunteer for combat duty. Thousands volunteered. These men were formed into provisional platoons and attached to white companies, fighting side by side. It was the first significant step toward integration in the U.S. Army. After the battle, a survey was conducted among the white officers and soldiers who had fought alongside these new black platoons. The results were stunning. The report, Opinions About Negro Infantry Platoons in White Companies of 7 Divisions, found that white soldiers' racial attitudes improved dramatically after fighting alongside black soldiers. The white officers, who had been initially skeptical, rated the performance of the black platoons as excellent. The experience of shared combat proved to be a powerful antidote to prejudice. It showed that integrated units could not only function, but function exceptionally well. These wartime experiences provided the hard evidence that advocates for military desegregation would use after the war. And Philip Randolph and other leaders continued their pressure. They had the data. They had the stories of success. They could argue persuasively that segregation was not just unjust, but also a threat to national security. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman, himself a World War I veteran, who had seen the inefficiencies of a segregated military, issued Executive Order 9981, officially ending segregation in the armed forces. It was a slow and often resisted process, but the order was a direct result of the lessons learned in the crucible of World War II. It was one of the first major victories of the modern civil rights movement, and it happened because the war made the old system untenable. How many high-ranking military officials privately wrote memos arguing against segregation on purely practical and efficiency-based grounds, and were these memos suppressed? What was the true casualty rate of black service troops who were often placed in dangerous logistical roles like handling ammunition at ports such as Port Chicago? Did the successful integration of platoons during the Battle of the Bulge lead to any undocumented, unofficial integration in other units facing similar manpower shortages? Number 8, can you read your way to a revolution? The power of a movement often lies in its ability to tell its own story. During World War II, the black press became the central nervous system of the African American community. It was the place where the frustrations, hopes, and strategies of the burgeoning civil rights struggle were hammered out on a national scale. Newspapers, like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, and the Norfolk Journal and Guide, were not just reporting the news, they were shaping a movement. Their circulation soared during the war, and their influence was immense. While the mainstream white press often ignored issues of racial discrimination or reported on black communities only in the context of crime, the black press did the opposite. They had war correspondents like those from the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association who reported specifically on the experiences of black soldiers. They told the stories of heroism that the white press overlooked. They also exposed the discrimination and mistreatment black soldiers faced within the military. A story about a black soldier being denied service in a diner on a military base might not make a mainstream paper, but it would be front page news in the Defender. This reporting connected the individual experiences of soldiers and their families to a larger national narrative of struggle. It was the Pittsburgh Courier that launched and championed the Double V campaign, giving millions a powerful slogan to rally around. These papers were relentless in pointing out the hypocrisy of fighting a war for democracy abroad while denying it at home. They published fiery editorials, political cartoons, and letters from readers that fostered a sense of collective identity and purpose. Reading the black press during the war was an act of political education. A sharecropper in Mississippi could read about a factory strike in Detroit or a legal challenge in New York and feel part of a nationwide movement. The black press also gave a platform to the leaders of the movement. The writings of W.E.B. Du Bois, Walter White of the Nayakipi, and Philip Randolph were featured prominently. They used the newspapers to articulate their strategies, announce their campaigns, and mobilize support. When Randolph was planning his march on Washington, the black press was his primary tool for getting the word out and building momentum. The papers acted as an organizing tool, connecting leaders with the masses and creating a national conversation about the meaning of the war for Black America. The government understood the power of the black press and was often wary of it. Some officials in the Roosevelt administration viewed the paper's constant criticism and focus on racial injustice as detrimental to wartime morale. There were even discussions about the possibility of charging some black editors with sedition, but the papers persisted, arguing that true patriotism required pointing out the nation's flaws in order to correct them. Their work ensured that the EV4 victory at home was never forgotten. By the end of the war, the black press had helped to create a more politically conscious, unified, and impatient black community ready for the next phase of the fight. What was the total circulation of black newspapers in 1945 compared to 1940, and how did this compare to the growth of mainstream papers? Were there any actual drafted indictments for sedition against black newspaper editors that were never filed? How did the letters to the editor sections of these papers function as a kind of early social network, allowing people in different parts of the country to exchange ideas and strategies for resistance? Number 7, how can a new organization change an old fight? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the AQP, founded in 1909, had long been the dominant force in the fight for civil rights, primarily using a strategy of legal challenges and lobbying. But the urgency and energy of the war years gave rise to a new organization with a new, more confrontational approach. In 1942, in a coffee shop in Chicago, a group of interracial activists, including James Farmer, George Hauser, and Bernice Fisher, founded the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Their guiding philosophy was a radical one for the time-direct, nonviolent action inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. The CORE's founders believed that waiting for the courts and politicians was not enough. They wanted to challenge segregation directly, in person, by putting their bodies on the line. They began by applying these tactics to everyday instances of segregation in the North. In 1942, they organized what is now seen as one of the first sit-ins of the civil rights movement at a Chicago coffee shop called the Jack Sprat Coffee House. It was a well-planned, disciplined protest where an interracial group sat at the counter, refusing to leave when the black members were denied service. After a period of tension, the management relented and served everyone. This was a new kind of protest. It was not a riot. It was not a lawsuit. It was a direct, peaceful confrontation with an unjust rule. CORE pioneered and refined these tactics throughout the 1940s. They organized stand-ins at segregated movie theaters and skate-ins at roller rinks. In 1947, building on a 1946 Supreme Court decision that banned segregation on interstate buses, CORE organized the Journey of Reconciliation. This was a precursor to the more famous Freedom Rides of 1961. An interracial group of 16 men rode buses through the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky to test the enforcement of the court's ruling. They faced arrests and violence, but they brought national attention to the issue and demonstrated the power of nonviolent resistance. Bayard Rustin, one of the participants, would later be a key advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. and the main organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. The birth of CORE during the war was significant for several reasons. It introduced a new, more activist wing to the civil rights movement. It demonstrated that direct action could achieve tangible, immediate victories, complementing the NAACP's long-term legal strategy. It was also committed to interracialism from its inception, believing that black and white activists had to work together. The war provided the perfect backdrop for CORE's philosophy. The nonviolent fight against injustice at home felt like a moral parallel to the violent fight against injustice abroad. The energy and impatience of the war years created a space for this new, bolder approach to take root. While CORE's early actions in the 1940s were the training ground for the sit-ins freedom rides, and mass demonstrations that would define the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. How much did the U.S. government monitor the activities of early core activists, and did they view their pacifist anti-war stance as a potential threat? What were the internal debates within older organizations like the NAACP about CORE's new confrontational tactics? Are there lost training manuals or pamphlets from those first CORE workshops in the 1940s that detail the psychological and tactical preparation for nonviolent protest? Number 6. Could a judge's gavel be as loud as a gunshot? While the war raged on battlefields around the world, another crucial battle for democracy was being fought in the courtrooms of the United States. The political and social changes of the war years created a more favorable climate for legal challenges to the Jim Crow system. One of the most significant legal victories of the era came in 1944 in the Supreme Court case Smith v. Allwright. This ruling struck down the all-white primary, a key tool used by the Democratic Party in the South to disenfranchise black voters. In the one party south of that era, the Democratic primary was the only election that mattered. Whoever won the primary was virtually guaranteed to win the general election. By declaring the Democratic Party a private club and restricting its primaries to white people only, Southern states effectively denied black citizens any meaningful voice in the political process. You could be registered to vote, but if you couldn't vote in the primary, your vote was worthless. The NAACP's legal team, led by the brilliant Thurgood Marshall, had been chipping away at this system for years. They brought the case of Lonnie E. Smith, a black dentist from Houston, Texas, who had been denied the right to vote in the 1940 Democratic primary. They argued that the primary was an integral part of the election process and that barring black voters was a clear violation of the 15th Amendment. The timing of the case was critical. The war had changed the political conversation. The United States was fighting a war against an enemy that espoused the theory of racial purity. The hypocrisy of the all-white primary was more glaring than ever. Furthermore, the massive migration of black Americans to the North had made the black vote a more important factor in national elections, including presidential elections. The Roosevelt administration, sensitive to this shift, submitted a brief to the Supreme Court that supported the NAACP's position, a notable, if subtle, intervention by the federal government. On April 3rd, 1944, the Supreme Court issued its 8-1 decision. The court ruled that the primary system was not a private affair, but was subject to constitutional oversight. The all-white primary was unconstitutional. The decision was a thunderbolt. It did not end all forms of voter discrimination. Poll taxes and literacy tests remained, but it dismantled one of the most effective legal barriers to black political participation. In the years following the ruling, the number of registered black voters in the South began to climb, from around 2% in 1940 to about 12% by 1947. This was a slow, hard, fought increase, but it was a start. It gave black communities a foothold in the political process. The ruling in Smith v. Allwright was a direct result of the changing ideological and demographic landscape created by the war. It was a crucial legal victory that paved the way for the voting rights battles of the decades to come. What was the nature of the private correspondence between the Supreme Court justices as they deliberated this case? And how much was the ongoing war a factor in their legal reasoning? How many local election officials in the South developed new undocumented strategies to obstruct black voters immediately after the ruling was handed down? Did the Department of Justice secretly track the increase in black voter registration after the decision as a metric for the ruling's effectiveness? Number 5, can you fight for the world and ignore half of it? The end of World War II did not bring a lasting peace. Instead, it ushered in a new global struggle, the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two global superpowers, each competing for influence and ideological dominance around the world. In this new context, America's domestic race problem became a major international liability. The struggle for civil rights at home became inextricably linked to the fight for hearts and minds abroad. As the old colonial empires of Britain and France began to crumble, dozens of new nations in Africa and Asia were gaining independence. These new nations, mostly populated by people of color, became a key battleground in the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union courted them, offering aid and political support. For the United States, the message was one of democracy, freedom, and capitalism, but this message was consistently undermined by the reality of segregation and racial violence in America. Soviet propaganda had a field day. Every time a lynching occurred in the South or a race riot broke out, Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts would blast the story across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They used America's race problem as proof that American democracy was a fraud and that capitalism was inherently racist. The question they posed to the emerging nations was simple. Why would you align yourselves with a country that treats its own citizens of color as second class? This was a powerful and effective argument. U.S. diplomats and officials felt this pressure acutely. They would travel abroad to promote democracy and be confronted by newspaper headlines about racial injustice back home. It made their jobs incredibly difficult and damaged American credibility. A State Department official named Dean Acheson stated in 1946 that the existence of discrimination against minority groups in this country has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. The federal government began to understand that civil rights was not just a domestic policy issue, it was a foreign policy imperative. This global pressure created a new incentive for the federal government to act on civil rights. The series of landmark Supreme Court decisions, including Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, were partly influenced by the Cold War context. The Justice Department's brief in the Brown case, for example, explicitly mentioned the foreign policy implications, arguing that segregation furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills. Our presidents, from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy, were all forced to confront civil rights issues, in part because they understood that images of state troopers attacking peaceful protesters in Alabama were being broadcast around the world, hurting America's standing in the global contest with the Soviet Union. The fight for decolonization abroad and the fight for desegregation at home had become two fronts in the same war for global influence. How many potential treaties or alliances with newly independent nations were damaged or delayed because of specific high-profile incidents of racial discrimination in the U.S.? Did the CIA or other intelligence agencies produce reports on the effectiveness of Soviet propaganda related to American race issues? To what extent did civil rights leaders strategically use the international press to bring global pressure on the U.S. government? Number 4, how can seeing the world change your view of home? For the more than 1.2 million Black Americans who served in the military during the war, the experience was often one of profound dislocation. A man who had never left his rural county in Georgia suddenly found himself in the bustling streets of London, the countryside of France, or the islands of the Pacific. This exposure to different cultures and different ways of life was a powerful and often radicalizing experience. For the first time, many Black soldiers saw a world without the rigid, legally enforced segregation of the American South. In Britain, for example, there was no Jim Crow. Black soldiers could enter any pub, restaurant, or movie theater they chose. They socialized with white British civilians who were often curious and welcoming. This was a revelation. The experience of being treated with simple human dignity by white people was transformative. It proved that segregation was not some natural, inevitable order of things, but was, in fact, a uniquely American system of oppression. The writer and activist James Baldwin, reflecting on this period, noted how European whites did not have the same burden of racial history, allowing for more natural human interactions. Of course, the U.S. military tried to export its own segregation. It pressured British authorities to create separate facilities for Black and white troops and warned local women against fraternizing with Black soldiers. This often backfired, creating resentment among the British, who saw it as America imposing its own ugly prejudices on their society. There were numerous racial battles on British soil, not between GIs and the enemy, but between white American soldiers and Black American soldiers, often sparked by the attempts of white GIs to enforce Jim Crow rules in British towns. In France, the experience was similar. The French, having just been liberated from a brutal occupation, often hailed Black soldiers as heroes. The struggle France had for Black artists and intellectuals in the pre-war years also contributed to a more accepting atmosphere. To be celebrated as a liberator one day, and then be told you cannot drink from a certain water fountain, The next was a dizzying contradiction. These experiences abroad gave black soldiers a new frame of reference. They had seen with their own eyes that a different kind of society was possible. This global perspective was crucial. It internationalized their understanding of their own struggle. They returned home not just as American soldiers, but as men who had seen the world. They were less willing to accept the parochial, small-minded justifications for segregation. Their fight was not just about changing a town in Alabama. It was about making America live up to the ideals it claimed to be fighting for on the world stage. This broadened perspective, this knowledge that the American way was not the only way, was a powerful psychological tool that they brought back with them, adding fuel to the fire of the domestic civil rights movement. What did the letters sent home from black soldiers stationed abroad reveal about their initial shock and reaction to societies without codified segregation? How did the military command deal with reports of conflicts between white and black GIs overseas, and were these reports systematically downplayed? Are there oral histories from elderly citizens in France or Britain that recount their memories and perceptions of the segregated U.S. Army during the war? Number 3. Could an army uniform be a target? The end of the war in 1945 brought celebration and relief across the United States, but for returning black veterans, especially in the South, the homecoming was often fraught with danger. The same uniform that symbolized heroism and sacrifice to the nation was often seen as a symbol of arrogance and a threat to the racial hierarchy by white supremacists. A black man in a uniform, carrying himself with the confidence of a soldier, was a direct challenge to the system of deference that Jim Crow demanded. The result was a wave of violence and intimidation directed specifically at these returning veterans. This post-war violence was not random. It was a deliberate attempt to put black veterans back in their place. A black man who had given orders, who had been treated as an equal by Europeans, and who now demanded his rights as a citizen, was seen as particularly dangerous. In 1946, the year after the war ended, there was a sharp increase in lynchings and racial violence. Many of the victims were veterans. The case of Isaac Woodard was one of the most infamous. Just hours after being honorably discharged from the army, still in his uniform, Sergeant Woodard was pulled off a bus in South Carolina, beaten and blinded by the local police chief. The incident, publicized by the NAACP and condemned by people around the world, shocked the nation and highlighted the brutal reality facing black veterans. In Monroe, Georgia, in 1946, two black couples were murdered by a white mob. One of the victims was George W. Dorsey, a veteran who had served for 5 years in the Pacific. His crime was unclear, but many believed it was simply his presence, his refusal to be intimidated, that provoked the attack. These acts of terror were meant to send a clear message to all black people, but especially to the veterans who were emerging as new community leaders: do not challenge the system. However, this campaign of terror often had the opposite effect. Instead of intimidating the black community, it galvanized it. The violence against veterans was so shocking, so profoundly unjust, that it spurred many people into action. It proved, in the most brutal way, the arguments of the Double V campaign. It showed that the fight was far from over. The NAACP's membership swelled as people reacted in horror and anger. President Harry Truman was so appalled by the attack on Isaac Woodard that it was a key factor in his decision to create the President's Committee on Civil Rights and eventually to desegregate the military. The violence also steeled the resolve of the veterans themselves. Having faced a foreign enemy on the battlefield, they were not so easily cowed. The violence confirmed that the system they were fighting was morally bankrupt and that a more organized, determined struggle was necessary. The brutality they faced at home turned many veterans from soldiers into activists ready to continue the fight on a new front. The uniform that made them a target also became a symbol of their resolve. How many cases of violence against black veterans in 1945 and 1946 went completely unreported by local authorities and the mainstream press? Did the FBI, in its surveillance of subversive groups, also track the activities of the white supremacist organizations that were perpetrating this violence? What was the psychological impact on black veterans who survived these attacks, and how did it shape their approach to activism, driving some toward nonviolence and others toward armed self-defense? Number 2, did the government plan to create a new black leadership class? No, it did not, but it happened anyway. One of the most enduring legacies of the war was the creation of a new, expanded, and more assertive black middle class and a highly trained leadership cadre. This was the result of the convergence of several wartime factors: the educational and technical training in the military, the opportunities provided by the GI Bill despite its flaws, and the skilled jobs in the defense industry. This new class had the resources, the education, and the organizational skills to spearhead the civil rights movement in the post-war decades. The military itself was a massive training institution. Over 1 million black Americans served, and while many were in service roles, thousands were trained as pilots, navigators, mechanics, radio operators, nurses, and logistics officers. They learned to operate complex equipment and to work within a large bureaucratic organization. This was a level of technical and managerial training that was almost completely unavailable to black people in the civilian world before the war. These veterans returned with a valuable and transferable skill set. Then came the GI Bill. As discussed earlier, its application was deeply discriminatory. But for the tens of thousands of black veterans who were able to use it, it was life-changing. It funded college degrees and graduate studies. The number of black Americans with college degrees soared. It created a generation of doctors, lawyers, teachers, and engineers. Thurgood Marshall's legal team at the NAAQP Legal Defense Fund, which brilliantly orchestrated the legal assault on segregation, was staffed by lawyers who were part of this newly expanded, highly educated class. The ministers who led so many local movements, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, were part of a highly educated clergy that had grown in size and stature. The economic boom on the home front also contributed. The stable, unionized jobs in factories and shipyards created a new black industrial working class with a degree of economic security. This security was the foundation of a new middle class. It allowed families to buy homes, to value education, and to have the disposable income to support institutions like the church and the NAAQP. A movement costs money. It needs funding for newsletters, for bail money, for travel expenses. This new, broader economic base was able to provide that funding in a way that had never been possible before. This new leadership class was different from one that came before it. It was larger, more geographically diverse due to the Great Migration, and had a different set of experiences. It included veterans who had seen the world and were skilled in organization and discipline. It included lawyers armed with new legal precedents won during the war. It included union organizers who knew how to mobilize workers. And it included a confident middle class that had the economic independence to demand change. The war, by accident more than by design, had forged the very people who would lead the charge against the system of segregation in the years to come. What was the percentage increase in black homeownership and business ownership in the decade following the war? How many black veterans who received technical training in the military were able to directly translate those skills into civilian jobs versus those who were blocked by discriminatory hiring practices? Can we trace the career paths of the first wave of black college graduates who used the GI Bill to see how many of them became directly involved in civil rights organizations? Number 1, what does it mean to fight a war for a country that doesn't fight for you? This is the central, painful question that hangs over the entire experience of black Americans in World War II. And the answer to that question is what, more than anything else, kickstarted the civil rights movement. The war was the ultimate stress test for American democracy, and for its black citizens, it exposed the nation's deepest hypocrisy in the clearest possible terms. The decision to fight, to serve, and to sacrifice for a country that treated them as second-class citizens was a profound and complex act of patriotism and protest. It was an act of patriotism because, despite the injustice, most black Americans believed in the promise of America, if not its reality. They hated the enemy's ideology of racial supremacy even more acutely than white Americans did, because they lived under a version of it every day. They believed that winning the war was essential, but their patriotism was not blind. It was a critical, demanding patriotism. It was a patriotism that said, we will help save this country but in return, this country must save itself from its own worst instincts. This created a powerful moral and political leverage. The black soldier became the ultimate symbol of this contradiction. How could a nation ask a man to die for a freedom he himself was not allowed to enjoy? This question was asked again and again by the black press, by civil rights leaders, and by the soldiers themselves. Every black soldier who fought, every black worker who built a bomber, was making a deposit in what Dr. King would later call the Bank of Justice. They were earning their citizenship over and over again. And after the war, they were determined to cash that check. The war forced a national reckoning. It made the race problem a national issue, not a Southern one. It tied the fight for racial justice at home to the nation's identity and its role in the world. It gave black Americans new economic power, new political clout in the North, new skills, a new legal and ideological framework for their fight, and a new generation of leaders forged in the military and in the factories. It created a collective sense of impatience and determination. The old ways were no longer tolerable. The gradual approach was no longer acceptable. World War II did not. Caused the civil rights movement. The struggle for freedom is as old as the nation itself, but the war acted as a powerful accelerator. It compressed a century of slow, painful change into a few short, transformative years. It brought millions of black Americans into direct contact with the mechanisms of modern life in the military, industry, urban living, and in doing so, it gave them the tools, the experiences, and the unshakable conviction to demand their full citizenship. The generation that fought the good war abroad came home to fight another good war. A war for the soul of America, a war that would change the nation forever. It was the real unspoken bargain that black leaders felt they were making with the Roosevelt administration by supporting the war effort. If the war had ended 2 years earlier, which of these catalyzing effects would have been the least developed? Ultimately, looking at the entire historical record, did the United States government see the loyalty and sacrifice of its black citizens during the war as a debt to be repaid or as a problem to be managed?